Hi, everyone. Welcome to another podcast from We Talk Science. Today we have a special guest with us. Her name is Dr. Maria Alvanou from the Neapolis University. Hi, Maria. How are you doing?
Hello. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm fine, and I hope you're well too.
I'm really fine. Thank you so much for joining us today. So you are actually in a field that I'm very unfamiliar with. You are a criminologist at the university. I would like to know more about what it is that you do. So shall we start with, what your PhD is and what you worked in and how actually you worked up to what you're doing today?
Well, I'm a criminologist. My PhD was from the University of Trento, international research doctorate in criminology, and I focused at the time researching female suicide bombers. I did my field work in Israel, researching during the Second Intifada women who were engaged in suicide attacks. It was very interesting for me to see pull factors, and generally at the time, it was a long time ago, women engaging in suicide attacks was a new thing. I chose this subject actually after the Moscow theater event, and at that time I was thinking about pursuing studies in a different field. I had finished my postgraduate studies in history of law. I was thinking of continuing that way, and then the Moscow theater event happened, and it was quite evident that not just terrorism would still be number one in the agenda. It was already after September 11th, but it was bizarre to see the new role of women, because women seemed to be operatives, but at the same time not to be so much on the lead. So this was quite interesting for me, and I started to search it, and women in terrorism started to be the field I wanted to focus on. And the least, I would say, researched field at the time was the field of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and women's participation. So this is how it all started. And I continued with working generally on security, meaning radicalization to violence, extremist movements, I had different teaching and lecturing positions and experience, mainly in Greece with police academies and schools, and now I'm online teaching the subject of homeland security at postgraduate level at the university, at Neapolis University, Paphos.
It's a wonderful story. So if I understand correctly, you are essentially looking at the role of women in radicalization and in criminal acts, essentially. So what aspect of this are you actually studying? So can you tell us a little bit more in detail about what are the factors that radicalize women, perhaps, or what is your research about, essentially?
Sure. Actually, one of the most difficult questions in criminology is why people commit crimes. And of course, if we see terrorism as crime, because we can see terrorism from many different approaches, but if we see it from the lens of criminology, the question goes back to why people commit terrorism in the same sense why people commit crime. And inevitably, when we have women perpetrators, we have to think about gender. And we have to think about gender because, yes, women participate less in those activities, in criminal activities and in terrorist activities, statistically. However, when they participate, it makes the news. And it is something that society talks about. So first of all, the interest is because whether we like it or not, it does make the news. It still is sensational, and it goes against the stereotype that society has. And the stereotype is that women are more nurturing, women are more peaceful, and of course all these are stereotypes, but still, the average person believes those things. So it startles people when women commit terror activities. The truth is that women were present in terror groups from the beginning of terrorism. And the question, as you put it, is what radicalizes, in particular, if there are particular parameters, women. And this is something that cannot be answered with one answer and in totality, because according to groups, according to periods of time, we have seen different types of radicalization to violence for women. And of course, even the phrase radicalization to violence is a phrase that is quite vague. It is a phrase, and it is a concept actually, that today we debate whether it can stand even as a concept, because what it says is that there is a pathway. But this pathway is not the same for everyone. And as I said before, it is a bit of a vague notion. Pull factors, push factors, these are some other concepts that we deal with in criminology. I would say that from my research, and again, I cannot generalize because my personal research has been, as I said before, on the Second Intifada and Palestinian suicide bombers, but also afterwards I have done research about women in the far right and women in the far left, especially in the Italian organizations. If we're talking about the Italian organizations and we're talking about the 70s, we could say that in the framework of secular far left-wing organizations, the pathway would seem quite similar with the male pathway. If we're talking about other types of organizations, if we're talking about the far right, I do find some differences. I do find also inside the organization some kind, if I could say it in a way that non-criminologists would understand it, I would say that there is a parameter of even abuse inside the groups, because women have a more utilitarian, let's say, use for the organization, and the same I would say also for different groups, like in some Chechen groups or in some Palestinian groups. Again, it depends on the group, and it has to do in those cases also with social issues. It has to do with the framework of the conflict. It has to do with patriarchy. It has to do with many other parameters. We cannot give just one answer. What I am really trying to highlight when I'm doing research about the participation of women is the different behaviors society has towards this participation. So for men, we will discuss radicalization in another way, and for women we will stay in very superficial issues. For women we will discuss always any romantic or interpersonal relations that the woman might have had with other members of the organization. We consider this, let's say, pivotal. And when I say we, I don't mean scholars. I mean mainly society, the news, and if we're talking about the way that even those people are depicted and their stories, I would say that we can see even some focus on the way that they look. So I rarely have seen in the news comments about the way that a male terrorist looks like, but definitely we can see comments about the external appearance of female extremists or terrorists. So we stay on superficial issues. We still cannot overcome the stereotype that women can't be violent. And you know, all this is mirrored, as I said before, in the way that society behaves, and sometimes even security. And why I say security? Because organizations have used women also because they can be considered above suspicion because of the stereotype. And I mean, although if you are a real expert, consciously you know that these are stereotypes, and you know, of course, that women can participate in terrorism and violence, but subconsciously and generally for people who are not experts, when they look out for someone who's a suspect, yes, women can be considered, beyond their look, as I said, above suspicion.
Okay. So this is really interesting. For the first question that occurs to me is that we're all very fascinated as well, not just with women who have been converted into to do violent deeds, but we also you're quite fascinated by women serial killers because there are just so few of them. I mean, I've read somewhere that there are if you look at the number of serial killers that we are aware of, that most of them are perpetrated by men, whereas women there are not very many of them, and if there is a woman serial killer, there's like movies made about them. So this is sort of the same concept, isn't it?
Yes, and the same stands also for active shooters. And I was in a conference about 3 years ago with statistics and everything showing, and of course statistics are showing that definitely women don't seem to participate. And I remember there was this researcher, and I asked him, so how do you explain these statistics? And a bit joking, he said, well, women maybe are better people. And of course we all laughed because this is a very simplistic explanation. Why women participate in certain types of crime has to do also with the ways women interact inside society, how they socialize generally. It has to do with their participation in certain types of activities generally that can give them or not give them opportunity. So there is a lot of background, and still there are some issues that still we cannot give an answer to. I mean, yes, of course we know that women participate less in hooliganism. Obviously there are less women participating generally in these kinds of sports and following these kinds of sports. So let's say, again, the framework and the opportunity is different and less. However, for example, in active shooting, or I will give another example, lone wolf activity. We're talking about terrorism, and the most prominent, let's say, hot phenomenon that we talk about is the lone wolf phenomenon. And there again, we see that women statistically are not represented with a number that can be considered, even substantial. And the question is why? In all other cases, we can talk, as I said before, about participation in society that is different. We can talk about patriarchy, creating obstacles for women to participate in the same way like men and have opportunities. But when we're talking about internet, when we are talking about the period, I mean, already we have had a year where nearly everyone has been locked inside homes, just being in internet and living online. We have seen the results of this kind of online radicalization already showing. There is research that shows the effects. We know, for example, that in previous years, online radicalization has led girls into fleeing to other countries to become jihadi brides. However, we cannot explain still why, and I'm not saying, thank God we don't have lone wolves that are women, that we don't have more lone wolves, this is what I mean. But still, this is a question to answer, why we don't have female lone wolves.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask you a fairly simplistic question then? When we talk about patriarchy, because you've mentioned that patriarchy is, one of the, what could be one of the factors that radicalizes women. The patriarchy essentially categorizes women as you said, nurturing and, non-violent, and these kind of things. So would you maybe go as far as to say that radicalization and violence from women is sort of a rebellion against the society's expectations and of the patriarchy? Can it be that simple?
patriarchy doesn't radicalize women, but patriarchy creates the framework that women, the framework inside which women socialize, women become part of society, women become active, women become members of the society. And it does influence several levels. Now, you mentioned a question that I would say is very important when we see, but this is a different kind of violence. I would not categorize it inside terrorist violence. But for example, we can see rebellion against patriarchy when women participate, often when women participate in national liberation movements, where they want to make sure that their voice is also heard. They are part also of the liberation movement. Unfortunately, usually when the conflict ends and liberation is won, women return to their previous status. This has been also noted by several scholars. So yes, there I can see a rebellion, or when we're talking about the participation of women in anarchist or far leftist groups, yes, there we can still speak about their participation, and we can see this also in their rhetoric as part of rebellion against patriarchy that oppresses women, has created social norms that push women far from the everyday agenda that men can pursue. You know, all those norms and rules that make our life different. I'm not using now the word, I mean, definitely also oppress women, but also make their lives different. And I'm using now this second phrase because sometimes, though we don't feel the oppression, we can still understand how our lives are different because of patriarchy, the different expectations that society has from us, the glass ceiling, all these issues. I mean, when we're talking about patriarchy, some women just understand very severe oppression examples, and they feel like, okay, you know, we live in Western countries, so we are allowed to drive, we are allowed to go out without a male chaperone, we are fine, there is no patriarchy. But that's not true. Patriarchy is embedded also in Western societies, even in ways that we don't understand. So yes, in some types of groups and in some types of engagement into those extremist activities, opposing patriarchy can be also inside the agenda.
This is very interesting. You mentioned also that you were doing some work with in the COVID-related violence as well. So I noticed on your website that you are part of several working groups on that. Could you share a little bit about what you're doing there?
Yes, well, the group Viral Violence is a group that was made by a sociologist, an anthropologist, and me. We decided to research different kinds of violence emerging after COVID-19, became the pandemic, and all these measures were adopted by several countries, because it was evident that a new era is starting for human relationships under the reign of fear. And for me, fear was the main word, the main title under which I started to work. I remember that my interest started when I first saw footage of people fighting inside supermarkets for toilet paper. And although this, but this was exactly my reaction at first. I laughed, but then I understood how serious it is and how much fear can mobilize us. We are creatures, and I mean, in criminology, when we're talking about crime, there is also this crime that comes from poverty and comes from the need of a person to survive. And in analogy, when you have a pandemic and you have this insecurity, and just remember that in the first wave of the pandemic, we didn't know exactly how things would go. Countries didn't know what would happen. We didn't know about scarcity or not of goods. And toilet paper, pasta in the supermarket became an issue for survival. So it was evident that when people have the survival instinct, the other person becomes the enemy because they have to survive. It's not about the toilet paper, it's not about the pasta, it's about survival. And survival also under a framework that countries spoke about an invisible enemy. If you remember, this was the narrative. Well, people, they don't understand invisible enemies. They want to make the invisible something very visible. And this became very visible to the person that was endangering their, their living conditions by taking more of the goods in case there was scarcity. But not just that. I was very much interested to see how this invisible enemy became visible, for example, to people of Asian heritage, who all of a sudden became, unfortunately, target of hate crime. People saw in them, mistakenly, but unfortunately, they saw the beginning of the pandemic. And this was even a political issue. If you remember, in the United States, there was a big debate about the phrase, the Chinese virus, that, that led into demonizing looking Asian heritage people. The scapegoat, it's not something that it was invented today. Crimes causing injuries and endangering people. And I think that today in the United States, it is discussed a lot about the rise of crime against Asian heritage people. So these were very interesting. Crimes causing injuries and endangering people. And I think that today in the United States, it is discussed a lot about the rise of crime against Asian heritage people. So these were very interesting, as well as COVID-19 related violence that had to do with the relationship between citizen and state. For the first time, in some countries at least, the police gained so much power over the everyday life of people. We saw police violence, we saw in some countries police abuse, enforcing the measures, and all these, unfortunately now, it's like a joke, but for a criminologist, all these are a paradise to research. This was a new world opening in front of us. Not a nice world, of course, but an interesting one.
Yeah. So I'm guessing that at this moment in time, if for a criminologist, as well as for psychologists, the data is rolling in, isn't it? You are gathering data, we're analyzing the effects, the long-term effects of COVID-19 and the lockdowns and the measures on different people, and mental health, as well as obviously criminology. I'm sure that there'll be a huge number of papers that come out of this research in the future. I'd like to ask you one more question. You're obviously, working in a field which is, characterizing people that could be categorized as fairly dangerous criminals. You're a criminologist. Have you ever had any kind of, I'm not sure how to ask the question, but do you feel safe perhaps, doing this work that you do, which is obviously very, very important to understand, how criminals work, and, how maybe we can rehabilitate them. Have you ever felt, that you're perhaps threatened by what you do? And do you also, and the second part of the question is, after all of the work that you have done, do you also see that there is hope? So there is a hope of, either stopping the radicalization in its tracks, or, rehabilitating people who are in that arena already?
Well, the first question, I grew up in a home with a father that was very active in criminal law as a lawyer. I started also as a lawyer, so part of being inside the world of, being in touch with crime, courts and stuff was part of everyday life. Scare me. This would be a very strong word, but sometimes, yes, I do feel uneasy and thinking about my safety, especially when I will take a position publicly in cases that arise, especially that have to do with, certain terror phenomena. But no, I'm not. I'm not scared. I mean, this is part. It's like a doctor, you know, fearing blood. You can't. I mean, this is part of your work, and you get. I wouldn't say you get used to it, but you do understand also the banality inside inverted commas of the whole even terror work. Generally, I am very hopeful because we do see. And by the way, I participate in the Radicalization Awareness Network that has been doing work for more than a decade, and we have participants that were active members of groups and dropped out. And not just this, but today they are leading exit groups themselves, they are leading de-radicalization groups and programs themselves. So not just there is hope, but I think we do have to try. However, I will add here something that we don't have, for example, de-radicalization programs tailor-made for women. And this is something that I would like to see in the future.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, Maria, this has been so enlightening to me. Thank you so much. I think that you're doing an amazing work in this area, and I'm really and I'm very happy to hear that not only is there hope, but there is definitely with an understanding of how this happens, we can actually do something about it. That does give me a lot of hope, in the world today. So thank you so much again for your time. I really appreciate it, and thank you very much for an interesting conversation.